that we actually have are going to be animation assignments. So our first one is the stick one, like this. Then we're going to have a bouncing ball, and then we're going to have a mech rig type thing. That's going to be just like a mechanical thing kind of moving around. So all of these will have basically the same kind of setup for rendering. Ideally, with everything that we render in this class, not just these projects, we want to show off the animation as best we can. Okay, so ideally that should be in the forefront of our mind. If it's not adding to the animation, it's most likely going to be taking away from it. So when we look at this scene, remember we have our, there he is, we have that little locator in the scene. And our stick is flying into the frame, doing its wiggle, and then going out of the frame. So obviously our framing has to be lined up perfectly. Now when you come into the class, if you don't copy your preferences, like this isn't my preferences, it'll do this because it's playing back as fast as it can play back. So I need to right click in my timeline, go to playback speed, and set it to either real time or play every frame max real time. Okay, so now what I'm doing is just kind of framing this out to see when I can get this to go in and go out, like what's going to look the best. I obviously don't want to be way back here. I obviously don't want to be right there because I'm going to start cutting stuff off and I'm going to lose it. I also don't want to be at this angle because then I'm going to see the object coming in from the side. We want it to be kind of a surprise. Okay. The guidelines here, this bar right here and the bar right on the other side, that's what's helping us frame our animation. So we want to make sure that those are lined up accordingly. There we go. So maybe I'll go like this, a little bit more. Oops, rotate. That's pretty good. It barely hits the side of that and then goes out of frame. Okay. So for now, I'm going to leave it there. So once I have my camera locked into where I want to see this, I want to create either a bookmark or set a keyframe on the camera or lock the camera or do something so I don't lose this position. So under View, under Bookmarks, I'm going to create a bookmark. So I'm going to call this Render Position. I hit Enter, and now I have a render position. So what that means is that if I accidentally do this, I can go back to my bookmarks, go back to render pause, and it takes my camera right back to that spot. Okay, so those are kind of neat things to have so that you always have the ability to jump into where you want to get to render. Now that doesn't do it for render time. Like if my camera is here and I render, it's going to render from there. It doesn't automatically jump. I need to make sure that I set this back there and then do my rendering. Yes, sir.
What did you name the bookmark?
Render POS, just render position. You can call it whatever you want. Now, for this, you're going to be turning in two things. One is going to be a play blast of your animation. Okay, a play blast is basically a low resolution quality image that I can see your animation crystal clear. Okay. So I'm going to switch this back to viewport, and we'll see if this works. It does work. Awesome. And I'm going to leave everything on. So I'm leaving the little crosshair on. I'm leaving the arrows on. I'm leaving everything on. I'm going to right-click in my timeline and go to Play Blast option box. Okay, so this one has no lighting, no fancy textures, nothing at all. I'm strictly looking at just the animation. So for the format, we're going to make it images. We're going to make them Maya. And then we're going to crank the scale up to 1. We also need to make sure that we save this to a folder. So I'm going to put it inside my images folder. And I'll call it playblast _ stick. And when I hit play blast, what it's going to do is it's going to go through each frame and then save that frame out to my folder. Okay, so if I go to my Sarcona folder, 2540, work, animated stick, images, there's all those images, okay? So it's like a rendering, but it's not a quality rendering. Now I did forget one thing, which is I wanted to change my display size from render settings. Okay, so make sure you have that in there also. And it'll just overwrite your original one. All right, so now it'll be 960 by 540. I'll be able to see the entire thing.
And what was that menu?
You just right-click in the timeline and go to Play Blast option box. Okay, so this is 960 by 540. Because I left my resolution gate on, it still shows up. That's fine, because that way I can still see where this goes out of frame. Okay, so this is what I'm going to use to grade the animation part of it. All right, that way I can see what your animation is doing and see what your curves are doing and everything. All right. Now I'll show in a second how to take that in After Effects and make it into a movie if you don't remember. The next part of this is going to be the rendering part. So for this I need to create some lights. So if you're in the rendering or the modeling class, we do a very similar setup. We're going to use area lights. So I'm just setting up my area lights here. I'm going to make my area lights have a quadratic decay. I'm going to crank up my intensity. I'm going to mental ray and using my light shape. High samples 1, and so on. Okay. Then I'll do a little preview and see that it's super dark. So maybe my 5,000 needs to be 25,000. It's a little bit better. Okay, I'll probably add another light, so I'll adjust that. So I'm just going to scoot this light over here, duplicate it, scoot it over there. So now I have two lights essentially lighting up my scene. There we go, that works. Now if you look, one thing that's going to be kind of something to keep an eye on are these shadows down here. We don't want the shadows to be taking away from our animation. So I'm going to turn the shadows off on one of my lights. So on my light number 2, I'm going to go to Shadows and just turn off Use Ray Trace Shadows. And I'll hit OK. And what that does is it literally does not show shadows. Okay, so only one of my lights is giving off shadows. See? So this is the only one giving off shadows now. And then I can play with it from there. Now the other thing I can do, or I'm going to do, is scale this light up just so the shadows are even softer. I don't want them to be terribly harsh. I don't want them to be very obvious. If that light is too small, those shadows will be incredibly hard, and it'll be really obvious that the shadow is moving along with it, and it'll distract our eye from what we're trying to view. All right, so now I need to the lights are good. Now I need to assign stuff to the backgrounds. Remember that the backgrounds are locked, our guides are locked, our geometry is locked. I don't want to touch them there. I'm going to go to my outliner and grab the stuff from here. So here's the background. So I go to the attribute editor and there's just a simple Mila on it. Okay? Don't complicate your scene. Keep your materials simple. You don't want to have crazy colors or textures or anything else. Again, taking away from it. If you're going to color something, we're doing it to enhance our animation. So with this, I'm going to, let's just say I'm going to create a light color back here. Okay, something like that, like a very light cream. Cool. I don't need reflections on here. Reflections are just going to take away from that animation because now my eye is going to be competing with the shadows and with the reflections. So I'm going to open up the main object now, and here are all the pieces of the main object. Now I've labeled these things perfectly so it's obvious what is what. The base is the top piece. The hinge is the little cylinder that rotates, and the bar is the bar that connects the hinges. Okay? So one way that we can kind of pull off a nice rendering of this is not to have everything be the exact same color. Okay? What looks kind of neat is if we have multiple colors inside here. I'm not saying a rainbow, I'm saying like 2 colors at the most. So I'm going to grab all the base bars and the bases and bars, and I'm going to assign a Mila to it. And I'll call this base bars Mila. And I'm going to give it a color. So let's say I pick kind of like that blue. There we go. So it's a little bit darker of a blue. Then I'm going to grab the hinges, and I'll assign a Mila to this. And hinge, Mila. And for this one, I'm going to grab that same blue, and I'm just going to slide the color over until I get to the orange area. Maybe make it a little bit brighter. We might make it yellow. We'll see how it looks. Okay, so now it's kind of obvious what we're looking at. We can see the blue, we can see the orange, so it makes it a little bit easier to kind of discern these different shapes that are inside there. I do think I want to change that blue though. That blue is incredibly dark. Material, base bars. There we go. And maybe I'll brighten up the oranges too. There we go. That's looking sexy. Cool. All right. So there's my materials. I haven't added anything crazy to it. I haven't added any textures to it. All I'm doing is giving it color enough to pop it off the background. My lighting is helping me pull it off the background. If I need to, I could add maybe a little bit of reflection to this, like a tiny amount. Okay, so I added a tiny amount of reflection to the orange, and I'll add a tiny amount to the blue. And then I can compare, here's the before and then here's the after. Does that actually help this animation? I need to get a little bit closer. Does it help me be able to read that surface better now that it's got that stuff on there? And honestly, there's not a huge difference. Okay, so why even put it on there? Maybe I'll crank these up a little bit more. 2. Yeah, you can see a tiny little speck right there. So the stuff is too small to even see any of this. So I'm just going to set those back to being just diffuse. And that should be sufficient for what we're doing. Cool. All right. All right, so now that I have this, yes, sir?
Just, sorry, but when you selected them all in the outliner, how did you apply them to them all at once?
Just out here in the hypershade, or the hotbox, just go down to lighting and shading there. So now that I have that, now I'm going to create an animation that is, let's say it's for my demo reel, okay? So with this one, maybe I have a different kind of camera that's kind of showing off this thing. So let's say I go like, I want to go lower, but I need to lower this light a little bit, like that. There we go. All right, and I'm going to really exaggerate this. So I'm going to grab the camera. I'm going to take my focal length down to like 20. Let's take it up to 15. There we go. I'm just making sure I cover that corner there. I don't want that to show. Alright, so let's do a little animated camera too. So I have my perspective view clicked. So I can set a key on it, and then I go up to, let's say, there, and I'm just going to rotate it over a little bit. Okay, and then when we go back to here, I'll just set a key there. That way we're kind of always moving. There we go. And then it zips off frame. So now this is something where we can kind of show it off with a little bit of motion. Nothing crazy. It's not a bunch of keys on it. This is not something we want, and I'm pretty sure I've shown this before. Set a key here. Set a key there. Set a key there. This is not the kind of motion we would want. Okay? It follows it, sure, but it's just like really hard to see anything that's going on. We're losing the animation. We want to focus on just the basics. So just this kind of thing, having a little bit of rotation in here is perfect. Okay? And I think I'm even going to go, yes, I'll continue, to like 16 or so, or 14. There we go. Just so I'm out a little bit more. There we go. All right, so let's say we're all set. I probably need to fix that. There's a tiny hair right there. I'm just going to grab my background and scale it up even longer. Good. So that should take care of that little corner. All right, so I'm going to go to my render settings and set this up. So I give it a name, Sarcona_stick animation. OpenEXR is perfect. Zips is fine. Name.number.extension. My start frame is 1. My end frame is, I think it's 130. Well, it zips out at like 95, so I'll just go to 120 or 110. Let's do 120. It's always better to have extra frames. My camera is my perspective view. I'm rendering this at HD 540. My quality is going to be up to 2. And I need to go down to my scene and turn on motion blur. Okay? There's two kinds of motion blur inside here. One is called no deformation. One is called full. If we have an object that is simply moving, rotating, or scaling, we can use no deformation. Okay? Because all the points on the object are basically moving, rotating, or scaling. If we had an object like a character and their body was jiggling around, we would use full because the jiggling is part of a deformation on the character itself. So in this case, we basically have geometry that is just moving or rotating. So we set this to no deformation. Now the reason we would choose that over full is because it's faster. Okay? This is definitely going to add some time to our render having it on there. So we want to make sure we're optimizing our stuff. All right. So now I'm going to go to the default for this is 1. I'm going to go to where this is about at a quick area, and then hit the render button and look to see what this is looking like. Last time, remember, it was too quick and we were like blurring out the entire thing. We couldn't even see it. Where this, that looks like that's at a good range. I may even want to go to 0.5 just because I know in some areas it might go really quick. Okay, and where it's extra blurry.
So is there stuff rendering out like that and then like putting an effect on there like After Effects or something?
In After Effects, if we were to put an effect on it, it puts it on the entire thing, right? So with this, do you see how like the top platform is crystal clear, and then the blurring is only happening on the leg, the very end leg? Okay, in After Effects, the whole thing would blur.
I thought in After Effects only if you put something in motion it blurs if something's moving.
in After Effects if you're putting it in motion. This isn't in motion in After Effects. This is a video.
That's what I mean. You can't blur a video.
Well, you can. You can put like Gaussian blur or fake motion blur on it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Blur, then you have to mask it and do everything. So
Right.
Unless you're animating in After Effects, motion blur is only good for that purpose in After Effects.
Correct.
Outside of After Effects, you have to have its own.
You have to have something else. Now, there is another way we could do this, okay? There is a way we could render out a separate pass, which basically records the motion. We would bring that motion into After Effects, and then we could use a plugin. We don't have it. We could use a plugin called Real Motion Smart Blur or Real Smart Motion Blur, something like that. And that would take the motion data plus this, put them together, and then we could do all this in After Effects. The benefit to that is that if we decide we want more or less motion blur, we can crank it up or crank it down pretty quickly because we already have the data. So that's definitely something you could do. Here, this is 10 seconds for a frame. That's not too bad, okay? So that's not too bad. Some of your frames might be 5 minutes once you add motion blur to it if you go crazy with it on later assignments. All right, so that's pretty good. So 0.5 is a good number for this. It's basically blurring a half frame instead of blurring a whole frame. So it's going to go less of a blur. The keyframe location is the middle. So it's basically taking like a quarter and a quarter of each frame. If I wanted to, I could set this to the start of the frame or the end of the frame, and it would go either this way or that way depending on what you do. Typically I leave it at middle. And then motion steps are if we're getting too much fuzz, like on mine, it's not bad. Okay, the motion blur is working here, but let's say that it looked really stepped, like here's one blur, here's one blur, here's another blur. We could add more motion steps in there to blur or blend that in together, okay? And you'll kind of see it once you realize it. Now,
So you define lines
for each one of those instances.
that causes the blur.
Correct. Now, most people will say, just tell me what numbers to punch in and I'll punch them in. Every time you change numbers, this increases your render time. If I put this at 500, 15, if I put this at 15, it's going to take longer to render, okay? In this case, probably not because there's not much motion blur, but you want to be aware of it, okay? This other area is the shape. So usually it's best to choose something besides a box. Basically, a box motion blur is blurring like the pixels in a box format. If you do it to a trapezoid, what is that? 6, 7, 8, 9? Oh no, it's just angled, right? Yes. Okay. So a trapezoid is just a different shape, so then they're kind of like offset, so it doesn't look perfectly clear. Okay, so I would typically choose a trapezoid blur for that too. Now, are you going to notice a huge difference between box and trapezoid? Maybe not. Most of the time, probably not. But it definitely does when you're adding in other stuff to the mix. If I was rendering out just the stick and adding it on top of another piece of footage, like an actual video, you may notice it because a video blur is going to be different than a real 3D blur. So just for fun, do we see a difference here? Yeah, you see a little bit of a difference. And again, it looks better. All right, that's cool. So the only thing we did in here was the same stuff we do in this tab. We gave it a name. It's an EXR. It's a name.number. We have our start and end frame, our camera picked. Our quality is set to 2. We could set this to like those. Go to our scene and we added in motion blur. Okay. So then we're going to go to our rendering menu and batch render. I always turn this off. I always crank this up. These are new computers. Where are we at? And they have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 11, 12. They actually have 12. Last semester we had 8. So we actually have 12 here. So I'm going to put that to 16. And then we hit continue.
What was that?
We have 12 processors on the computer. So I always take the render threads and I add something to it. So I just go to the next iteration. That way it kind of forces it to be higher. Sometimes if you put it at whatever it is, it always goes below, which is stupid. All right, so this is going to render.
It's going to be super quick.
Yeah, not really. While it's rendering, we put a render sign on the computer to let people know we're rendering. most of the stuff for this class may be able to be rendered overnight, okay? Especially before the next class, because you guys are fortunate. No class is in here until 5 o'clock tomorrow night. So you basically have all tonight to render stuff, and then all day tomorrow until 5 to render stuff. We also want to go to the task manager while we're rendering, just in case someone comes in here. We want to go to processes. We want to find the Maya batch, and we right click, set priority below normal. That way, in case someone comes onto the computer and they need to use it, the computer doesn't stop them from using it. The batch render doesn't stop them. So I can still record my lecture. I can still go into Maya and do other work in here without affecting it. If I didn't have that on there, it would basically bring the system to a halt if I tried to do anything.
Yeah, but doesn't the render go slower?
It does only when someone's on it. So the second someone gets off of it, then it's fine.
Okay.
Now, let's pretend there's a class after this. If I come into my class and the computer's running slow, what's the first thing I'm going to do?
Turn it back on.
Right, reboot it. Your render stops. So it's better to not have that happen, where it's just an inconvenience, it goes slower, than this. And even though you're rendering, still monitor it. Don't just assume that in 6 hours when you come back, it's going to be done. If you're on campus, pop in, check in your rendering, see where it's at. Okay. Now, once it's done, all of your stuff is going to have to go into After Effects for the final put together for it. So with this one, I'm going to double click. I have to wait because it's going to pop open a box in a second. Maybe it's not. It will once I start doing something. So you're going to double click in this box here, and we're going to import our footage. So I go and find my footage. So remember that play blast that I took at the beginning? See, there it is. There's the play blast. So I just say import, close that window, and then I can drag this down to the new comp button. I can preview it. Ooh, gorgeous. And then I can go and make this a movie. So I go to File, I go to Export, I go to Add to Render Queue, I go to Lossless. I set this to QuickTime. There's no audio. I don't need to worry about that. Oops. I need to go to Format Options and make sure that my codec is set to H.264. Hit Enter. Hit OK. Give this a name. 22. No, this is 2540. Finished. And I will call this Arcona Stick Play Blast. Okay. Everything that you turn in needs to have your name on it. I don't accept it if it just says my animation or stick animation, because I don't know whose it is. Okay. So make sure you have your name, what the project is, and what I'm supposed to be looking at. So in this case, it's the Play Blast. So I would be looking at the Play Blast. It's a stick assignment. There we go. Yes, ma'am.
Like that rendering that you're doing for Maya, does it render that cross in there?
This?
Yeah.
Oh, this?
Yeah.
No, that won't render.
Okay.
Okay. What was your question, Jesse?
I was just wondering what was the difference between Play Blast and the actual render.
The Play Blast, there's nothing here. There's no textures. There's no lighting. There's no shadows. If we have reflections, there's no reflections.
Well, it's whatever you see in your window. If you have lighting, rendering, everything turned on, Play Blast.
Right.
It's all whatever's in your window.
Right. Okay. And then I'll hit render in here,
Basically.
and then it'll render out super quick, and that part's done.
Move your bounding box. Render that box.
Okay. So that one's done. And then once the other one's done, you'll see I'm already on frame 34 of this. So then I just have to wait for that one to finish. Now it's always a good idea to right click on these things and open them. I don't know why this isn't a default. Open them with DJV. DJV will play back your stuff in real time so you can see what it looks like. That's gorgeous. It hasn't zipped in yet. We're still waiting for it. Suspenseful. All right, so that's that one. Okay. Now there's other stuff in here too that you could turn on if you're trying to preview it. Because I'm using Viewport 2.0, we could turn on things like motion blur in our viewport. So that way we can see what the motion blur is going to kind of sort of maybe look like. Obviously in here it's like way too much. There you go. Especially when you first turn it on. There we go. Now it's giving us something a little bit more realistic looking. We can see the motion blur. We can also turn on things like ambient occlusion to help help the look of this. We could also turn on anti-aliasing and smooth our stuff. So you can actually get a pretty decent rendering or a decent preview just out of your viewport. And there's a lot of companies who that's where they render their stuff out of. Not a lot of companies, but like if you're thinking of previews, like they want to see what the shots are going to look like or what the animation is going to look like, you can crank these settings up, send them a play blast. I've done plenty of jobs where they just want to see what the animation looks like. And play blasts are great ways to be able to say, here's the play blast, look at it and see what you think of the animation. That way you don't have to render everything out. Okay, we even have, it looks like a shadow, it's not a shadow. You can kind of see right there, a little bit of darkness. That's the ambient occlusion.
I never understood what ambient occlusion ever does.
If you look at creases of things, like, let me switch to here, okay? So when objects are close to each other, and I'm going to turn motion blur off. When objects are close to each other, it creates basically like a shadow, okay? So right here, there's a shadow. Inside here in these little creases, it creates these little shadows. And what they do is they help kind of define the surface a little bit more and kind of make it pop out a little bit better. The creation of this was when they made Titanic. They looked at all the 3D people they had on the boat, and they said, wow, that looks really fake. How do we make them pop more? Ambient occlusion. So they added ambient occlusion to everyone, and everyone looked like they were on the boat better. Crazy. Let's see where we're at here. 54, 53.
Where did you work before?
Here. I just read a lot. Yeah.